Hello everyone, my name is Caitlin Kavanagh and I'm a product marketer here at Revenera. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Mitigating Risks in Open Source and Software Supply Chains, a Global Outlook. I'm joined by Leon Schwartz, Principal at GTC Law, and Andreas Kotulla, Founder and CEO of Bitsea. Today, they'll be discussing the latest regulation changes in the US and the EU, taking some real-life examples to explore what's really changing in the world of open source and what you need to know to help your clients and organizations navigate their legal rights and responsibilities. Before we get started though, let's go over a few housekeeping details. Firstly, today's discussion will be roughly 45 minutes long. If you have any questions or comments along the way, please add them in the Q&A tab and we will try to answer those at the end of the session, as time allows. If we don't get to your questions, don't worry, we will follow up with you after the session. We also have a number of resources available to download on today's topic, so please check those out in the handout tab. That's all from me for now, so over to you, Andreas and Leon.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I think it's safe to assume that everyone who is here, if you're in the right virtual place, right, knows what software is. But I think before we get going too far, we want to just remind people that some things that you don't often consider as code, such as data, specifications, interfaces, APIs, they really do count as software when it comes to your use of third-party things. Open source software is software that is generally available in source code form, right? I think we also all know that. And I think we also know that it's free as in speech, not necessarily free as in beer. One interesting wrinkle here is that in order to qualify as open source, under the Open Source Initiative's definition, open source software can't discriminate against people or actions, right? So you can't say, oh, and by the way, you can't use this in a commercial setting. If you do that, you can't be an open source license. However, of course, there are some licenses that make it difficult to do that. The other thing I think it's important for us all to remember is that open source is absolutely everywhere, right? And I'm sure Andreas will agree with me on that one.
Yeah, so when you look in the development landscape, experienced developers, they do not write code from scratch. They will take code which is there in the company, their own code, some commercial packages, and of course, open source. And in the meantime, you will find open source solutions for almost every issue you may run as a developer. It's very effective. The open source has a high quality, very often it's supported by a big community. So the efficiency goes up, and we see that across all industries, in automotive, IoT, healthcare, finance. So wherever we look, there's a huge amount of open source code, which is used also across all different operating systems like Windows, Linux, embedded systems, containers, software as a service. Even when you look at an electric toothbrush, it will have tons of open source software. Or cooking appliances like a Thermomix is also famous for containing many different open source components. What is important here, so overall, the usage of open source is quite good and there are many advantages. There are some risks that need to be managed, and we will be talking about some of those today. So the first one is compliance that Leon has mentioned already. You need to make sure that you know what is in your software, if there are specific obligations that you need to fulfill to be legally compliant. A second risk that you always have is the security vulnerabilities. As any software, open source software may also have security vulnerabilities. But if you have a commercial package, your vendor will tell you, or your supplier will tell you that there is a risk and he will deliver a patch. For open source, you need to look for a solution by yourself because only you know what kind of open source packages you have. So you will need to check the community if they have developed a patch and then install that. Another risk is export restrictions, especially when we look at encryption algorithms. They often underlie specific export restrictions, and when you have those in your software, you cannot export it wherever you want. Each country has its own export control laws, and you just need to make sure that you can follow all the regulations. And again, for that, you need to know what is in your software. A last risk, which is often forgotten, is the operational risk that open source components may have. So very often you may have this big community supporting it, but it may also be that you selected a component which is very old and no maintainers left looking at updating it or writing security patches. So in that case, you either need to set up your own team to be able to write patches, or you can select a different component that is more maintained. So it's important to be aware of these risks. In open source, we see it everywhere. We have some numbers on a later slide, but it's 70 to 90% of the software that is produced today. That's the amount of open source that is in a typical project. I assume you know most of that, so we will just jump on.
Yeah, thanks. And so it's interesting, Andreas, that you mentioned toothbrushes, because believe it or not, I had one of those little GPL notices come out of the box with my last toothbrush, and my immediate concern was, what exactly are we doing here, right? Is this going to connect to my dentist office and tell them exactly what I'm doing and how often and how well? So that toothbrush went back, and I got one that didn't have Bluetooth in it. But yeah, it really is. Open source really is everywhere, and it's important to remember that there are risks, as Andreas mentioned, and we'll definitely get into them a little bit more in a couple of slides. But there are certainly benefits, right? And we all know what they are. I don't think we need to spend a ton of time explaining why open source is really better than sliced bread in so many different ways. Interesting survey here from Bitkom, and I know that Andreas is very much involved with that, so he's going to help walk us through it. I thought some of the numbers that you see here on the screen are interesting. I think some of the other numbers in the survey were extremely interesting. So, for example, 35% of respondents say that cost savings were the #1 driver of open source adoption for them, right? Which makes sense. Open source is free. Now, at the same time, 14% said that legal uncertainties around licensing was the biggest disadvantage, right? Only 14% of people think that legal issues might be an issue for them when it comes to open source. Kind of interesting. 73% indicated that features of open source software are vital in their open source selection, right? So if it does the thing that you want it to do, that's kind of key. That makes perfect sense. But less than 40% said that of the licensing, right? And as we'll see in a couple of slides, that's kind of interesting because the open source licensing varies very, very, very much. And so 60% of people said that wasn't an issue for them when selecting a component. Right. 32% of people that use open source software 32% of the people that use it have a strategy for the use. Others just sort of use whatever happens to exist, which is kind of interesting. And then, in something that I'm sure makes Andreas lose sleep at night, 40% of the people perform manual checks for security vulnerabilities as opposed to using some sort of tooling. And 3% don't check for security vulnerabilities at all. Right, in open source software, which I'm sure works out really well for them in the end. So yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So what is very interesting about this Bitkom study? I'm not sure if all of you are aware of Bitkom. It's the biggest German computing association with thousands of companies being in there. And we run this study every 2 years to see the changes and to see how people react. And it's across all different industries, across all different company sizes. And we can see in the last couple of years, the big corporations with thousands of employees, they have set up their own open source offices to manage open source well. But the SMEs, smaller companies, mid-sized companies, they still are all very new to this subject, and they very often don't know what to do and how to react. So these numbers are a little bit still alarming. So there's a huge amount of companies not managing open source as they should.
Right. There's a lot of work to be done. I think that's very fair. So we talked a little bit about the the sort of the ubiquitousness of open source, but here's its importance, right? And that image there, that's Randall Munroe's graphic on the right-hand side, is sort of perfect, right? You've got all of this infrastructure that's balanced very neatly on this tiny little project. And there's an example of it on the left-hand side. I'll talk about it briefly. So about 2021, there was an issue where one morning the world woke up and their Rails builds failed, right? People panicked, but fairly quickly started to realize that it wasn't just their code, right? Everybody else's Rails builds were failing. So it must have been something global, not something within their organization. In the end, what it turned out was that there was a small program called MyMagic. And as you can see, it's MIT licensed, which is a permissive license. And what it does is it figures out the file type, excuse me, from the file extension or from the contents of that file. So that's fairly useful. And because it's MIT licensed, it's fairly easy to approve it for use. So it was used all over the place. And then what happened was MyMagic's developer maintainer was alerted that code from a project called Shared Mime Info was used in MyMagic. And that code was licensed under the GPL. And this meant that MyMagic could not be licensed under the MIT license and be in compliance with the GPL obligations for the code it pulled in. So completely understandably, right, if you're a maintainer of a small project that's free, that you're not making money off of, and somebody starts saying that you're doing something legally wrong, right, developer panics, and immediately changes the license to GPL, and then goes ahead and says, well, you know what, there are these old versions and they're under the MIT license and they shouldn't be. So he just removed them, right? That was the quickest solution, is to make them go away. So of course, anyone whose build relied on pulling one of the earlier versions, right, the last one of which, the latest one, had been the latest version available until that morning, right, could no longer build. So it created a mess, and I wrote a little piece on LinkedIn about it. You can check it out later. So basically, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Like this, everybody tried to do the right thing, and it created a mess for absolutely everybody. In the end, it all gets fixed, right? The GPL licensed code gets removed from MyMagic, the license goes back to MIT, everybody's happy. But there were a couple of days there where it was really dicey for everyone and really a lot of headaches. And really, the only thing that you could have done as a software vendor who uses open source components is to have done a code scan, right? Because if you had scanned the code that you're using beforehand, there's potential that you would have found this dependency, right? You would have found that MyMagic had GPL licensed code in it, and then you would have known about this ahead of time, right? So it wouldn't have been a surprise to you. So that's a potential solution. So I mentioned licensing. I know that I can guarantee that pretty much everyone has seen either this slide or something like this before, right? The key thing here is that there are permissive licenses, there are less permissive licenses, right? Open source licenses can't be talked about as sort of, open source licensing. It's very much dependent on which license it is that you're working with. So don't think of them as solid. We talked a little bit about risks already, so I don't think we'll spend a ton of time here. But I want to talk a little bit about litigation risk and transaction risk, in addition to the ones that Andreas already covered, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit more about security, because there's always security risk. So with litigation, it used to be the case that you would get these developers who would contribute to open source projects, and they were very much into the idea that software should be free and open for everyone's use. And so if they found that you were using it in your closed source software, they'd reach out and they'd say, well, no, like this is not okay. You should be open sourcing your programs. But it was, ideologic differences in terms of how software should be built. Now you're seeing a lot more of company on company warfare, right? You're seeing people that are saying, well, no, look, I have this open source program, but I also have a commercial version. And you're using the open source version in a way that you shouldn't be. So what you really should have is a commercial license. So now that becomes a much higher dollar proposition usually, right? Because they're looking for money, and they're obviously looking at your past use as well as your future use. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? It's no longer just ideological reasons. Transactions are a big part of what we do at GTC, right? And so it's, obvious and has been for a long time that investors, buyers, people like that are interested in how it is that you're using the software, what's in your products. Why? Well, because they're paying for it, right? They want to know that you're not infringing anybody's copyrights. They want to make sure that what they're buying has value. Increasingly, large customers are doing it too, right? Because they're worried about impact on their operations, their software. Diligence during a transaction can be absolutely all-consuming. It can grind development to a complete halt, and you usually have a few weeks to do it, right? It doesn't. There's a short time frame there. So you're going to have to make representations. You're going to have to make warranties in your agreements, right? Whether it's your licensing agreements with your clients, whether it's agreements for mergers, acquisitions in that context, right? And without doing your own diligence, without knowing what's in your code, which is sort of where all of this comes out to, you're not going to be able to do that, right? Which means that your transactions are going to get delayed, right? You're going to have to pull your developers off of developing software and get them to answer questions. It's painful to do this at that time. It's better to do it ahead of time and be prepared. So, and of course, obviously, all of this extends to security issues, right? Because in the context of transactions, if the code is written in such a way that it is not secure, if somebody has not done the groundwork to check for vulnerabilities, if somebody hasn't engineered it correctly, then this exposes your investors and your buyers, and they don't want that. So again, we're back to security risks. So, and I think we can go ahead and talk about MGM.
Yeah, so when we look at all the different risks that you have just seen from open source, the focus of our talk today is the new legal regulations that we have in the US and in the European Union. And there's a reason for that. And that's mainly the security vulnerabilities that you have in software. And we have some examples from what happened only recently. And one nice example for a security attack is an attack on the MGM resorts. You may know it's a big hotel chain. They have some fancy Las Vegas hotels, and they were hit by a ransomware.
Just a couple.
Yeah, they were hit by a ransomware attack, which compromised all their computing systems, and they had to shut down operations completely, which was a major hit for them. So the guests were locked outside their rooms. They could not enter anymore. You could not do any bookings. All the reservation systems were not working anymore. They had to spend around $10 million on cybersecurity companies that helped them get rid of the attack. And with the people not being able to book, the rate of the occupied rooms dropped by 5% for almost a quarter. Overall, that was an estimated $100 million loss that MGM had to cover due to a security risk or exploited security risk. Interestingly, it was done by social engineering, and somebody was able to break into their system with a ransomware attack, and they exploited a vulnerability in an open source component. And there are statistics that around a third of the ransomware attacks, they begin with an exploitation of a known security vulnerability in an open source component. So that means it's very important that you regularly patch and check, and again, that you know what is in your software and have a very tight control and management of the of your open source components. So to get a handle on these security risks of open source or generally of software, and based on several of these incidents, the European Union and also the US, they introduced a number of new regulations. And the basic aim of all these regulations is that we have secure products, so that consumers have secure products, that critical industries have secure software products, that the financial industry has secure products. And there are many rules around that. And we're going to talk about that in detail for the next couple of minutes. So in Europe, we see the NIS2 directive, DORA for the financial industry, NIS2 for critical infrastructure, CRA for all the remaining digital products. And in the US, we have the executive order, which is currently being written, and Leon will talk a little bit about that one.
Yep. So let's start with the executive order on cybersecurity. So as Andreas mentioned, it's very much security focused, right? The United States government and President Biden does not much care if you're in compliance with your license obligations for your open source software. However, right, it reinforces good practices, right? As Andreas said, it requires a software bills of material, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what that actually means. But for now, you know, it's just a list of all the components that's in your code, right? To be produced for your products if you're dealing with the U.S. government, right? So why do we care about this if we're not dealing with the U.S. government, right? Because most of us in our daily lives, other than speeding, do not deal with the U.S. government. Your customers might be, right? You don't know how your software is going to get used, and if they fall under these requirements, then they're going to start asking you questions because they can't look into your code that you've provided to them. They might have to get the answers from you, and also because others are starting to ask for this information now as well, right? The reason why the U.S. government cares about security is the same reason why large companies care about security, right? They don't want to get hacked. Nobody wants to have their guests locked out of their rooms, right? And I mean, that's the beauty of having keys on our cell phones is that, yeah, when there's a hack, there's no way for you to get into your room, right? So what we're seeing in our practice is more and more customers are asking for software bills of material, right? Even when they're signing up just for SaaS services, not for delivered software, which is definitely a change from years past. Now, the latest, right, developments in the executive order sort of scheme as of September 2024, so very, very recent, is this self-attestation requirement. Still aimed at security practices, does not apply to open source software by itself, right? So if the federal government goes out there and says, hey, you know what, we want to use MyMagic, it's this great component. They're not going to reach out to the maintainer for MyMagic and say, hey, we have this questionnaire that you got to fill out and you got to attest that you've done all of this security work, right? That's not going to work. They're going to have to do the work themselves. But if you, as a commercial software vendor, are using open source software in your commercial software, then you're responsible for it as well as your code, right? So again, you can't really comply with this unless you know what you're using, because you're going to attest for the software you've written, but the software you've pulled in, you don't even know that you've done it. Right. Note the requirement for good faith effort to maintain trusted source code supply chains by employing automated tools or comparable processes to address the security of internal, written with the clarity of mud, of internal code and third-party components and manage related vulnerabilities. What's really comparable to a scan, right? As far as automated tools go. So if you don't use automated tools, what would be considered comparable? I don't know. I can't think of anything that would. So clearly, this requires a security policy, right? And if you can't attest to all the things that are required here, you have to have a plan of actions for what you're going to do to get there, right? So there is a mechanism for, as this kicks off, not everybody's going to be able to say, oh yeah, we're perfect, right? But if you're not perfect, you have to have a way to get there. You can use a third party to certify you instead of self-attestation. And because the self-attestation has to be signed by the CEO, and I think there's a reason why, by the way, they're making it the CEO as opposed to the CTO or the CISO. I think it's to make sure that that all of these risks sort of percolate all the way up, right? Because it's easy for the CEO to just go, whatever it is, the government requires this form, just sign it. Right? When it's their own name, all of a sudden they might pay a little bit more attention to it. So anyway, third parties can certify as long as they're FedRAMP certified. I think what's going to happen is that there will be options, right? Companies will spring up that are going to do this, allow companies to outsource this function so they don't have to do it internally. But again, the actual work, right, will still be on the developers. You still have to have the bill of materials. You still have to identify the components. You're still going to have to answer questions, whether it's to your own internal teams or to these certifiers. And I think at the very bottom here of the slide is the really funny bit. They think that the public reporting burden for this is 3 hours and 20 minutes. So first of all, oddly precise timing in government documents, which of course makes total sense. Second of all, it might take 3 hours and 20 minutes to fill out the form. No, I don't think the form is that long. But it's certainly going to take you longer than 3 hours and 20 minutes to compile all the information that you need, right? So I think that's where that is. So let's talk a little bit about Europe, and for that, I'll certainly hand off to Andreas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when we look into the European Union in response to the growing cybersecurity threats, there are these new regulations like the Cyber Resilience Act, the Digital Operations Resilience Act called DORA, or the NIS2 directive. And it's all to strengthen the resilience, security, and compliance of digital products. And all of these laws, they have different focus on a different part of the industry. There are some similarities, which I have put together in this picture. And all of these laws, they want to have a strengthened security requirements. So all three aim to enhance cybersecurity by enforcing stronger security standards and measures across various sectors, ensuring the resilience of critical infrastructure, product, and services. So this is the first pillar that you can see on the left-hand side. And all of the laws, they require you to have a risk management framework. So each regulation mandates a comprehensive risk assessment and management practices to identify and mitigate cybersecurity and risks proactively. One nice thing is that it's now harmonized across the EU, and there's lots of cooperations between the different organizations in the EU. And so all the different cybersecurity laws, that was one aim, that they are harmonized, that the companies acting across Europe, they just have to follow one regulatory framework, and that will make it easier for all the companies. One big part is the incident reporting obligations that you get. So all of the laws require you the reporting of cyber incidents with different times that you have to respond. And all of them enable you to quicker response and minimizing the impact of potential breaches. And the last one is the accountability. So we've heard from Leon already that in the US for the new act, the CEO is responsible. We have a similar accountability in Europe. So for most of the laws, the owners, the CEO is responsible to make sure that all of these obligations are met. If we look at these 5 pillars, they are all standing on software, and the software itself is composed of the proprietary part and open source part. And we've mentioned already that the open source often is 70 to 90%. But if we look at the proprietary part, for that, it's fairly easy to be able to fulfill all these new regulations. You can just have a contract with your supplier. And in that contract, you will have how you act on patching. You can have a patch process. You can regulate all of that. For open source, there is nobody whom you can have a contract with. So you need to be able to cover that somehow yourself, or you need to get a service from somebody who offers you to look at the open source software and to enable you to write, for example, patches. So in the next couple of slides, I will look at the different laws in a little bit more detail. And I will highlight the goal, the focus, and the core principles of each of these laws. So let's start with NIS2. That has been around for quite some time. So there was a NIS1 before. And the revised Network and Information System Directive, it's an EU directive designed to improve cybersecurity across the European Union. And it affects all the industries that are working in critical infrastructure. So that may be water supplies, healthcare companies, electrical companies. And there are pretty high penalties that you get when you do not follow these core principles. And there is a standard organization in the EU that will collect all the reports from all the different companies. The main obligations are, again, you need to do risk assessments. You need to develop and implement incident response plans, and you need to secure your whole supply chain. And what is interesting is the whole supply chain. So not just the software that you write and that you have, but from all your suppliers and from their suppliers. And again, from their suppliers. So you need to make sure that the software that is actually running in your system, which was created by maybe hundreds of different vendors and suppliers, you need to control all of them with your risk management strategy. And you have these significant reporting obligations where very quickly after an incident, you need to report what it was, how you handled it, your workaround. And you need to make sure that is all set up very well. The basis for all that requirements is that you know your software. So that's what I put in the bottom again, and you will find that on every slide. So the basic thing you need to do is you need to know what is in your software. You need to maintain a comprehensive list of all the components, not just the commercial ones, but also all the open source components. And not only your own ones, but also from your third-party providers and all the dependencies. And that can be quite some effort to get all of that together. If we look at the DORA, again, the goal is strengthening security and operational resilience. DORA focuses on the financial sector. So all the banks and credit institutes, they need to follow the DORA directive. Again, here we have the risk management that needs to be followed. You have operational resilience testing. So there are many audits that you need to follow. We have a very strict incident reporting. So within 4 to 24 hours after identifying an incident, you need to report it. And there needs to be an intermediate report after 72 hours. And a final report within 1 month of the incident. The third-party risk management explicitly includes the vulnerability and patch management also of open source components. And I've mentioned briefly that patch management, you can contractually or you can have contracts with your suppliers, but for open source, there is no suppliers. So you can just grab the components in the internet like you like, but then you need by yourself to regularly check if there are any security or non-security vulnerabilities. You need to check by yourself if there is a patch, and you need to install it by yourself. And so for the DORA, there's also supervision and compliance. So you need to control your third-party providers. And the financial, in Germany, it's the BaFin. The BaFin is from the government, an organization which will check and control all the banks and do regular tests there, so that all these obligations are met. And then finally, we have the Cyber Resilience Act, which has been established recently and will come into effect sometime in 2025. It basically covers all the remaining digital products. So whenever you have some kind of hardware or software that is sold to any users, no matter in what form, you need to follow all the obligations that are in the Cyber Resilience Act. This affects almost all manufacturers of hardware or software products which are connected to the internet. It doesn't matter if it's open source or not. Whenever you have users in the EU, then you have to follow these guidelines. Again, the penalties are pretty high. So if you like doing or following all the obligations, the penalty can go up to 2.5% of your annual worldwide revenue or turnover. So it's quite serious law that everybody needs to follow. And again, you need to know what is in your software, and only then you can follow these guide obligations. So
yeah, I think Andreas, I think one of the things that's coming out that's very, very key from these European regulations, and it's the same thing in the executive order in the US, is, like you said, it applies to the whole supply chain, right? It's not just that the vendor who's directly selling to the government has to account for their software, right? Because it's everything that's in that software, it goes all the way upstream. Right. So even if you're not directly dealing with the government, or even if you think that you're not going to fall under the European regs, though I think, listening to you is becoming very, very clear that even those of us who just sell software in the US or think we just sell software in the US, we don't. Right. Because as long as you have users in Europe, all of a sudden you do have to worry about these things. But even if you did just sell in the US, somebody else picks up your software, they use it somewhere else, and all of a sudden you're going to get pulled into this one way or the other. I think that's very key.
And so I think we have highlighted it now very often that you need to know what is in your software, and there are standard ways on how to find out, so that not everybody needs to reinvent that. And a standard way of writing up what is in your software is an SBOM, a software bill of materials. So it's like a list of ingredients to a food package. You can consult the label, then you know what is in your food, and you can decide if you want to buy it or not. So an SBOM is the same just for software. You can look what is in your software and then decide if you want to use it, consume it, or if it is harmful for you. The concept of an SBOM is very well established. So if we look at traditional manufacturing, if you look at the supply chain, there's always this bill of materials, and especially car manufacturers, they know from every small single screw in their car where it comes from which supplier, where it has been put in a car, and where it is now sitting. So when there's any problem, it's possible that the car manufacturer reaches out to the different drivers and owners of the car and tells them, please come into the next garage. We have a problem with this and that, we'll repair it. For software, unfortunately, that is very often not the case. So we see many companies, they are not aware of what they have, and they don't know where is it installed, in which version, in which release, on which machine is the software actually running. But that's the basic idea of the SBOM. So you should know what you have used and where you put it and where it is running. In Germany, there's the German Federal Office for Information Security, the BSI, and they have issued a first standard of what they recommend, what should be in an SBOM, and like the information about the supplier, a timestamp, a version, a name of the package, and other unique identifiers, also dependency relationships, and also a license. And all of that you should capture for all the software that you use, that you consume, and you should know where you put it in which products, so in which variants. Very often, not all software will be in all the different variants of a product you produce. So that should be clearly written up somewhere, so that in case a new security vulnerability is detected, that it's easy for you to find it. The BSI, for example, they say they detect 80 to 90 security vulnerabilities a day. So every day you would need to check all your products against these new security vulnerabilities and if you are affected. And we have seen that a typical product consists out of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 open source components. And then you can immediately see that it's not possible to do that manually. So you need to set up some automated tool chain that automatically gets all the new security vulnerabilities and checks it against your bill of materials.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things here, right? So the software bill of materials is, as Andreas said, is a relatively new thing, though it shouldn't have been. And there are different ways, different formats that you can follow, right? There's a format called the SPDX, which is probably dominant at this point. And that makes it machine readable. It makes it human readable, right? So you can sort of, everybody shares the information in the same way. One thing that I like to sort of interject in here is that the SBOM is not all the data that you need, right? It's a good starting point, and really it's a view of the data. So my sort of suggestion, my practical advice is, as you're doing your diligence, you're going to collect a lot of information. So in addition to identifying all the components, right, that's the information that goes into the SBOMs. You're going to collect the license text. Why? Because for compliance reasons, you're going to need the actual license text that was provided with the component, so you can put it in your notice and attribution file and give it to your customers. You're also going to collect usage, right? Because we talked about how open source licensing is not a monolith, right? There's permissive licenses, there are restrictive licenses. So for some of these components, you're going to figure out whether they're distributed, whether they're hosted within your solution, whether they're modified, how you link them with your code, right? If there's a programmatic link between your proprietary code and the open source code. Once you've collected that information, that allows your legal department to say, okay, fine, this is acceptable, you can use this. Don't lose that info, right? Make sure all of that is stored alongside with all of this information that's needed in the SBOM. And so that way, once you have this data, right, somewhere, pick a database of your choice or a spreadsheet, that doesn't matter, right? Store it somewhere, but that allows you to create all of these views. So at the end of the day, you can produce a software bill of materials. You can produce a notice file. You can produce materials that are requested during diligence, right? Which is not SBOMs or notice files, but are something in between, right? So keep all of this information and definitely try to hang on to your usage info, because having to recreate it time and time again makes your developers very, very angry, and you don't want to do that. Developers are not people you want to have angry at you. So I think next we want to talk a little bit about what everybody's been talking about for the last couple of years with good reason, right? So generative artificial intelligence, or GAI. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the terms that we're going to use. The thing we're all hoping for, or perhaps we're all terrified of happening someday, is called artificial general intelligence, AGI. So that's thinking, decision-making, emotions, the works, right? Think Data from Star Trek when he had his emotion chip in for that one episode. And I know I can't see everybody in the audience, but you all better be nodding and understanding what I'm talking about. If not, go watch Star Trek. So at this stage of the ball game, that's all this is, though. It's science fiction. We don't have this. The question is, when are we going to get there? And really helpful estimates from experts range from years to centuries. So I guess for today, I get to keep my job, and we all get to keep ours, but it is coming. Now, artificial intelligence, AI, is much narrower in ability, right? It mimics human intelligence, but usually for some sort of a narrow purpose. It's not for everything. Machine learning is how we achieve AI, right? So these are algorithms, models, data, lots of data that are used to create it. And deep learning is sort of a subclass of machine learning, right? So you have multiple layers of models to build the AI. And then finally, at the very bottom here, we have GAI, right? So set of deep learning methods that can generate data, such as text, images, most importantly to us here, software code. Right, so let's move along here. So here we'll focus on the GAI part, of course, right? On the part that generates stuff. Because that's what's relevant to us. Developers use these tools, right? You can see some of the tools listed on this slide, right? And developers use it to generate, complete, optimize, test, document their code, right? It's a tool that they're using. Whether they tell you or not, they are using them, trust me. And of course, this brings with it some risks, and we'll talk about those in a second. But first, Anyone notice anything strange about the picture that was generated by Dolly over here on the right-hand side? And I know this isn't interactive. I know you can't tell me. So everybody, sort of think amongst yourselves, and then we'll point some of these out. So for starters, the lines of code appear to be on the back of the monitor, not the front that's facing the developer. Now, we see them as right to left, so maybe the monitor is transparent, which would make it futuristic, I suppose, but probably not particularly useful as a monitor. Second, I asked for someone who was furiously coding, which any of us who have done any coding whatsoever is meant to describe or modify the coding, not the person, right? And what we have here is somebody whose hands are very still, so he's not actually moving, but looks very, very angry, which is not what I had in mind. I could go on and nitpick the fact that the keyboard has 2 cords coming out of it, neither of which go anywhere. The mouse has none, but that's not really fair, because if I were to ask to draw a picture like this, you would get a stick figure that looked worse. So that's not really fair. So I think basically, as you can see, I can find many issues with an innocent drawing here, right? Imagine what can happen when you ask for code, right? So let's look at some of the issues. So some of the risks are on the slide. When it comes to generating code, the main ones are copyright infringement, breach of contract. So those are what we'll focus on today. These are related in that the code generated by these tools could contain the actual code that we use to train the model, right? And we have a few examples of that in the next couple of slides. So in this case, you're using code that's been generated for you. And you're not complying with the underlying license terms because you didn't even know that they were there, right? All you have is code that was generated for you. You don't know where it actually came from. So of course, you can face a claim of breach of contract. That's because you're failing to do something in the contract that's required, such as notice and attribution that I mentioned earlier. Or there can be an infringement claim, right? You're using the code without it being licensed to you. That's infringement. Often you're going to get both. So the licensor can maximize recovery. There are other issues, as you see on the slide, and there's many, many more. For example, remember the picture we just talked about? Would it surprise you to know that no matter how many times I asked it to draw me a developer, the developer always looked sort of male, right? That stinks. But that's the reality of where we are with the data that's being fed into the models, right? We'll do some of those examples, I think next here of code that's being spit out.
Yeah, so I have come up with one example. I hope you can read the code. And so what this, it's a Copilot example, and it shows you on the left-hand side, the first 2 lines are what the developer put in. So he's just suggesting what he wants to write, often in form of a comment. And then all what you see down here on the screen on the left-hand side is what the Copilot has learned. And it's just giving you an algorithm. Here it's some metrics operations. So that makes it very quick for a developer to develop code. It's a good help. Of course, you need to check it, because sometimes the code may not be fully correct. But at least you get a quick idea of what kind of code you should write. And why can Copilot do so? It's because Copilot was trained with lots of open source code. And especially for Copilot, GitHub was used, and basically all the open source code that was there was put into the training in the language model by training. Now, if that is true, then we should be able to find the origin of this code. And we looked around, and that's what you can see on the right-hand side. And there actually is the original code that was used to train the machine. And you see it's exactly the same. Even the comments are exactly the same. But there is one missing part. And I will give you some seconds to compare the left and the right-hand side. So left in green is the output from Copilot. And on the right-hand side in pink, that is the original that you can find on GitHub. And when you look at differences for the between left and right, there are only a few. On the next slide, I have marked that for you. So it's basically the license and the copyright. So that makes it very difficult for you as a user to even see that the code that the AI has given you has been written by somebody else. You don't know about the original author and you don't know about the license. So it's extremely difficult for you to follow the obligations that the original author has put in. And so this is just one example. If you look on the internet, there are hundreds where people have researched the output of the AI compared to the original text that you can find on GitHub or other big repositories. So generally, the use of AI makes development much more efficient and easier. On the other hand, you need to be aware of the risks that also Leon has just mentioned. And yeah, you somehow need to handle that. There was an interesting attempt by Microsoft. And Leon, I think you will be talking about that in a minute.
Yeah. So you're talking about indemnification. We'll cover that in a second. So one thing I do want to say here, not to, we don't want to make AI sound evil, because guess what? Developers do this too, right? There are code share sites. There are plenty of places where people reuse code. Again, any of us who've ever written code never want to write the same thing more than once, right? So if I wrote this in my previous job, I'm now at a new job. I know this code exists somewhere. I'm going to take it. But you can train your developers, right? Developers are human and they understand, hey, you keep doing this, you're going to lose your job, right? We need to be able to attribute the code properly. We need to be able to use it with the proper permissions. It's a lot harder in the, appealing to one's ability to pay their mortgage to train the AI model. The AI model doesn't have a mortgage to pay. There are settings that you can put in place that say, do not reproduce the training data. But as Andreas has told us, they don't always work, right? And there's tons and tons and tons of examples like this, and it's fairly scary, right? Because really, what you need to end up doing is code scans, that can find snippets, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But first, offers of indemnification, right? So vendors have realized that this is a problem, right? This is just the nature of the beast. And again, same happens to us, right? You read a book, you like the passage, and then you're writing something and you unintentionally infringe, right? You unintentionally copy that which is in your mind from that book because it was so good. But it's at much greater scale when it comes to AI, and it's much harder to sort of find. So they're trying to solve some of the issues, right? They offer you indemnification if you get sued. But does it resolve our concerns? And I think likely not, right? It's better than having nothing, which incidentally is what you get when you use the tools for free, because you don't get indemnification unless you sign up for the enterprise versions. So in order to qualify for indemnification, which is when the vendor steps in and covers your liability when you're sued, in order to qualify, you have to turn on filters to keep training data out of the results. That's good, right, in theory, but like I said, those often fail. Problem is that indemnification is generally tied to unmodified suggestions, which makes sense in the traditional software licensing model, right? If Andreas licenses a software program for me, and then he goes off and he modifies it, and he gets sued because of the modifications he made of infringing somebody else's code, I shouldn't be on the hook for it. The code I gave him didn't infringe anything. It was his modifications that created the problem, right? But that's not how we use code that's produced by these GEI tools, right? They're code snippets that we then put into our code. So what happens if you go ahead and you change the code a little bit more than what was shown on the previous couple of slides, but you change the variable names to comply with your coding guidelines, right? Or you add comments to the code, right? You haven't functionally changed anything. So does that mean that it's not really modified, or does it mean that it's modified for the purposes of this indemnification provision? I don't know. It depends on the actual language in your actual agreement, right? But it could make it very much moot. So the other issue here is that indemnification in and of itself, right, is not the end, right? There's more to the license agreements that you have. So the indemnification offers here are tied to your overall agreements with the vendor, right? And as all of us who've looked at any software license at any point in our lives know, every software license agreement is going to have a waiver of consequential damages, right? So things like loss of business revenue, loss of ability to make money downstream, right? So you're going to get coverage for direct damages. So if you get sued for $100 million, right, indirect damages, fine. But any loss of revenue, your inability to sell your software, that's carved out, right? So that's number one. Number two is chances are that your vendor agreement with the Microsofts of the world, right, your overall agreement for licensing their software is going to have a cap on their liability, right? Because otherwise they're taking on unlimited risk associated with their software, which they're not going to do just based on what you're paying them. And usually the cap is typically, again, the past 12 months of fees that you've paid them, which is not, it can be quite a bit of money, but is it enough to cover your liability for an infringement claim? Right? Maybe not, again, but it comes down to you have to really understand your agreements, and you have to really understand what the limitations are before you can rely on this and say, okay, that's it. I don't need to do anything else. We're good here. So I think in the end, it's a good thing to have. Certainly good practices are use the enterprise versions if you're using them within your commercial products of development. But it's not a cure-all, right? This isn't something you're just going to rely on and forget about. So if it's not, right, then, well, what do we do, right? How do we solve for these things? And I know we're running late. This is now 55 minutes into our 45-minute presentation. So we'll try to go quick on this last slide, leave some time for questions at the end. But in the end, all of these things, right? And there's a reason why, Andreas comes at this from the security angle, and I come at it certainly from a licensing and compliance angle, right? But there's a reason why we do this together today. It's not just because we like each other, though we do. It's because this all fits, right? To solve the security-related problems, to solve the license and compliance problems, to solve your executive order problems, or to solve your European reg issues, to solve your AI-related issues, it all boils down to the same thing. You need a good open source software policy that involves both compliance and security. You need a mechanism to review your code bases for components, including snippets, right? So not all code scanners are created equal. Make sure that your vendor, such as Revenera, is capable of finding snippets, because that's very, very key, especially when you're using GAI tools to generate snippets for you, right? They need to be able to look at that code and see if they can find the missing chunk of licensing that was removed. Right. You need a policy covering the use of GAI tools, right? And you definitely need software bills of material. You need all of this stuff that tells you what it is that you're using, so you can respond to security issues, so you can have your license compliance taken care of. And so if somebody comes in and claims, hey, you're using my component, you're not in compliance with my license, you can say, no, but I am, right? Here's the diagram, right? And we do this for clients all the time. Here's the diagram of how your component is used, and that's why it's okay to use it, right, in this context. So we're not in breach of anything.
Thanks, Andreas. Thanks, Leon. That was really informative and interesting. We did overrun a little bit there. So we may just go a couple of minutes over the hour so we can answer a few questions. And before I jump into that, I just want to quickly talk about Revenera's SCA audits and services. But please do add any questions in the chat in the meantime while I'm talking, and we'll get to them in a second. So just to make sure everyone's aware that at Revenera, we have a team of analysts with an average of over 10 years expertise in the SCA space. As part of our services, we provide open source code reviews for IP and security vulnerabilities, creation of SBOMs, and other services related to software composition analysis. So if you want to find out more information about that, please do check out the Revenera website. All right. So the first question I've got here, Leon, maybe you want to take this one, is how prevalent is the use of GAI tools?
Yeah, so if we were live and there were developers in the room, I would ask people to raise their hands if they use GAI tools, and I think pretty much everybody would raise them. We've all toyed with them, right? And developers are certainly using them professionally because they are helpful. Just like spell check is helpful to us lawyers, though it doesn't always catch mistakes, as I found out with the slides for this presentation. Thanks again for fixing those. So, but yeah, they're definitely using them, and it's important for us, for legal professionals, to get ahead of the curve, right? You can't tell developers that there's this neat new tool that they can use to generate code, but no, you can't use it, right? That's not going to work out.
Great, thank you. And Andreas, did you want to take this one? Does CRA apply to all companies of all sizes?
Yeah, so the interesting part is it applies to everybody. So no matter if you are a small company or a big company, all have the same rules. So CRA applies to all digital products, but not for the financial market and not the critical infrastructure. And however, all the other companies, they need to follow the obligations from the law.
Great. And another one here, another AI one, responsible for generative AI hallucinations. All large language models inherently hallucinate.
Absolutely, and if you don't believe that, go ask them something you know the answer to. So this is what sort of the limitation here of this not being as interactive as an in-person thing sort of stinks, because I'd really like to ask a follow-up question about this when it comes to generating code. But yeah, in the end, right, whatever you end up using that's been generated for you, you're responsible for, right? So your GAI policies are going to need a review step, right? When it comes to, and when I say GAI policies, by the way, it's not one policy, right? It's multiple policies. And usually what I tell people is that you're going to want sort of a mission style level, very short, top level thing of like, this is how we use AI. We use it in a good way. And then for each individual use case, you're probably going to want a policy, because the way that your marketing professionals are using AI tools is very different from the way that your coders are using AI tools, right? And sure, right, if I ask Copilot or any of the other ones, I don't mean to pick on Copilot incessantly here, but if I ask them to document my code, to put in comments, they're going to come up with some nasty things to say, right? Just because, again, they've been trained on comments from actual developers. And those of us who've developed code have seen some very interesting things that people put in the comments. So you're responsible then for making sure that all of your actual policies for human developed code also apply to this, right? So you're going to want to review the results. You're not going to take something that's produced by AI and just use it, right? Unless you're that one lawyer who submitted a brief full of cases that AI made up, which didn't work out for him. So I don't suggest it.
Great. Well, we are a couple of minutes past the hour, so I suggest that we leave it there and pick this back up in another webinar. So
yeah, sorry, Caitlin. Yeah, and I was going to say, I know we didn't actually put our contact info on the slides here, but I'll be happy to add it to the version that we circulated for circulating the slides. But yeah, feel free to reach out to us anytime. As I usually like to say at the end of these things, I like to talk about open source, which doesn't make me particularly popular at parties, but it does serve a purpose. So if you have any questions we didn't get to, if something we said didn't make any sense to you, or if my answer to any of the AI questions didn't quite hit because that's not what you were asking, but by all means, follow up.
Great. Right. Okay. Thanks very much.
Yeah. And thank you everybody for listening.
For joining.
Yep. Thanks everyone.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.